I'm really grateful to UNM Press and the Latin American and Iberian Institute to inviting me to speak for a few minutes about my research. I plan to speak for about 35 minutes, and then I'll stop, and if there's a desire to have conversation, we can have conversation, and then people can back to their busy schedules. I wanted to begin with an archive story. This is an image from an archive in Corrientes, Argentina. And in 2000, last year in June, I had about an hour and a half to go to an archive before I was scheduled to give a talk in the neighboring town of Resistencia. So I went with my 15-year-old son who was traveling with me. We crossed the Paraná River. Corrientes and Resistencia sit on the border of what's called the Chaco region of Argentina. It sits in the north of the country, kind of the northeast, north central in some ways. And we went to this provincial archive that was managed by a local historian who had retired from the professoriate. And he managed this archive, giving his own time without pay. And so it's a fairly humble archive, but I was grateful to this historian who dedicated his time and energies to keep this thing going. I wanted to see if there were any Guarani language sources in this archive, because over the past couple of decades, historians and especially linguistic anthropologists have been out finding these records in all kinds of repositories. And so I asked the director of the archive if, what he thought. I told him what project I was doing, and he basically said, "You're not going to find anything." Now, Corrientes has this kind of special relationship to Guarani language and culture because many locals there, Argentines, grew up speaking this variant of Guarani, but they tend to strip away from the speaking of the language any indigenous past or indigenous culture. And so they want to be true Argentines, but without that kind of complication of indigeneity. Well, I was curious about a section of the archive called the colonial government section. And there were something like 16 tomes. And so I started flipping through them. And within about 10 minutes, I had found some of what is the earliest document recording indigenous language sources from the Rio de la Plata. It dates from 1682, and these are elections, city council elections of a pueblo called Itati, which was part of the kind of Corrientes jurisdiction. So I share that with you just to indicate that in our field, this study of Guarani language documents is really fresh and new and burgeoning. And it's thanks to many other scholars who have done lots of other work. But this is work that's fairly recent, built on the kind of shoulders of some earlier linguists. And so we're really only kind of 2 generations into this new field, and really a new generation of scholars who are really taking time to study these texts. And so I'll explain some of my book and where the book comes from, and then I'll move in the second half to a discussion of some of these indigenous language records. So I want to begin with a broad survey of Guarani peoples in South America. This map shows the various Tupi Guarani linguistic groups as they spread throughout South America. You kind of see a circle shape here. But Guarani peoples moved into what is today Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, maybe 400 to 500 years before Spaniards arrived. Their language is expanding. It's moving throughout the region. And when Spaniards arrive, it moves even further. The Guarani peoples it's a kind of imposed term. Most Guarani peoples don't use the term Guarani to refer to themselves, but we use the term to describe a people who shared a language or dialects of the Tupi-Guarani linguistic trunk family. And these are peoples who lived in villages that might contain dozens to sometimes a few thousand people. So it was a very loose kind of organizational structure. At the core, you have these patriarchal led units that are an extended family. And within these, you might have several heads of households, so to speak, several heads of lineages. And these might share a longhouse, a kind of structure in which families and lineage groups are ordered through the hammocks that are strung up in these longhouses. And then within the village itself, you might have several of these longhouses. Some of these villages could be quite small. Some of them could be in the thousands. Usually they were on the smaller side. These are groups with a very dynamic political organization. You have leaders who are leading these extended families. Then you have leaders who we might call confederacy leaders, who can get villages to come together for a festival. Maybe they're gathering other villagers and usually through kinship bonds to go to war with neighbors. We have some of these confederacies operating and coordinating to such a degree that they're actually moving into unknown territories and conquering local groups. But for the most part, they're very loose. They're not very stable. They can be broken up fairly easily. So there's no overarching kind of political power. And what I want to now do is sort of trace the arrival of Spaniards and begin to explain what my book project, Colonial Kinship, tries to do. Much of the Guarani historical work that was done at the time that I started my project in 2011 was moving towards this discussion of Guarani, especially Guarani who associated with Spanish society, as initially having a profound effect on Spaniards, and then suffering basically cultural loss and degradation under Spanish society. Beginning in the 1950s, you have some anthropological work that is looking at this early history and showing the ways in which Guarani kinship shaped Spanish colonial institutions. But much of this scholarship then concluded that by the turn of the 17th century, it's pretty much cultural disintegration for Guarani who are associating with Spaniards. On the other hand, there's a kind of scholarship that looks at the Jesuit Guarani missions, these mission towns administered by Jesuit priests, as a kind of separate process. And I think they're right in that. But there's a tunnel vision that's happening in that kind of scholarship that's led to some overgeneralizations about the two processes happening at the same time. And what my book tries to do is to bring these two fields together to focus on Guarani under Spanish rule through the lens of kinship. And what I end up finding is that through an analysis of socio-historical records, civil, criminal litigation, we get some details that begin to show the strength of Guarani kinship and its effects on Spanish society, without discounting the tremendous violence that Spaniards inflicted on Guarani societies throughout the region. So a bit of background here. Spaniards began reconnoitering the main river systems in the Rio de la Plata in the 15 teens. By the 1530s, they made a permanent expedition that led to permanent settlements. And one of the first settlements is the city of Asunción. These early Spanish expeditions were trying to find a route to the silver-rich Andes. And so for the first few decades, Spaniards are just launching expeditions to the north and to the east, and then creating towns as they move along. But their eyes are set on the Andes. By the 1550s, it becomes clear to Spaniards that the situation in Peru is such that they're not going to be able to go and claim these territories. And so you begin to see more permanent Spanish settlement. When Spaniards arrive in Paraguay and encounter peoples we call Guaraní, they engaged with them via trade. They engaged with them via sometimes war. And it's this first phase that I'm interested, this first process. And so Spaniards are going to provide trade goods. We should probably call them gifts. They're going to gift axes, knives, fish hooks, all kinds of metal objects, sometimes cloth, to Guarani communities. And if we think about how this indigenous people related to outsiders, one of the primary modes of relating to outsiders was through kinship. One of the great ethnologists, ethnographers of South America, Claude Lévi-Strauss, described Tupi-Guarani kinship as a kind of institution, particularly the brother-in-law or the father-in-law, son-in-law relationship. This was the way that Guarani became friends with, associated with outsiders, is through kinship. And so Spaniards are quickly becoming Guarani's brothers-in-law, and the term in Guarani is tovaja. This term becomes a kind of institution. It's institutionalized and even named as such. One anonymous chronicler said that the city of Asunción was founded by means of cuñadazgo. Cuñado is brother-in-law. And so it's a kind of brother-in-law institution. This process of creating kin, right, channeled into Spanish households, female and then handfuls of male servants. Spaniards call them criadas, which is a word that means servant. They also use terms like pieza. And so there's a kind of continuum of servitude along which Guarani were situated. Some of these servants experienced tremendous violence, sexual violence, and were completely unfree. Others, I find in my research, are maintaining relationships to their households, to their villages. And so, for example, in 1545, in a criminal litigation trial, there's a deposition that takes place that has really nothing to do with the tenor of the case, but it comes out in the deposition that a woman who was subject to a Spaniard had lost a family member in her indigenous village, and a member of her village came to get her and take her back home so that she could be involved in the mourning ceremonies. So these kinds of traces, I think, tell us fill in some of the blanks, that we have this variation of servitude, this variation of service that's going on in Paraguay. The gifting is also really, really important. And Spaniards are going to establish this pattern. By the end of the 16th century, Spanish officials recognized that they need to involve priests in this long conquest that's going on in this really provincial area. And so Franciscans first and then Jesuits second are invited to begin an evangelical process, the creation of mission towns. The Spanish word is reducción. And these priests are going to follow Spanish patterns to a degree. They're going to enter Guarani territories with chests full of axes, knives, fishhooks, and what they call trinkets, right? Little beads or what have you. And so they're going to begin with gifts, but unlike Spaniards, the priests cannot enter into kinship relationships. In fact, the term that Guarani used to describe priests is aba re. And aba is a term that could mean human. It generally means man. It's a gendered term. And re is this suffix that means different. And so it's a term that probably marks the priests as celibate men who are engaging with Guarani communities differently. Priests are also engaging these communities as epidemic diseases are washing over these communities and inflicting devastating losses. And so priests constantly talk about healing and becoming doctors and healers to Guarani. So as the Franciscans and then later the Jesuits begin building mission towns, right, they're going to engage these communities in different but also overlapping ways. So this is a map showing the main mission towns that dotted the region around Asunción. Asunción became the capital of the province of Paraguay. All of these towns were founded by Franciscans, and then over the next several decades they were turned over to secular priests because the Franciscans had a constant crisis of staffing. They couldn't get enough priests there. This map is showing in the black stars, and you have the Franciscans and then secular missions. And then you have the white dots and white crosses. You have the Jesuit mission towns that grew up in the Paraná and the Uruguay River regions. Now, the Jesuits began preaching really to the Spaniards in Asunción, but inspired by some of the changes going on throughout the Spanish Empire amongst the preacher class, right? You have Jose de Acosta's Jesuit in Peru and in Mexico. You have this renewed emphasis on evangelization and a renewed emphasis on priests learning the indigenous language. The Jesuits moved towards preaching to indigenous peoples. And so by 1609, the Jesuits are beginning to move out into the so-called mission territory. They first go to the region of Guairá, which is this part of the map that is positioned to the far right and to the east. And they're going to found 13 missions there, sort of neighboring a very small settlement of Spaniards in two different cities. It's a region that is situated between the Spanish settlements and Portuguese Sao Paulo. And what happens from 1609 to about 1630 is that the Jesuits have tremendous success. They begin drawing Guarani into these new mission towns. And one of the reasons that this is taking place is because the Portuguese are coming into the region and enslaving thousands upon thousands of indigenous people, especially Guarani. One Jesuit even admitted in a letter to another Jesuit that it was because of the mission towns, he feared, that the Paulistas invaded in such great numbers, because they were conglomerating Guarani groups into these mission towns. It's this incredibly dynamic and traumatizing experience for Guarani peoples. By 1628, you have this massive Portuguese invasion. And the Portuguese, by the way, are bringing thousands of their own indigenous allies into these slaving expeditions. The Jesuits are going to relocate these missions along with the Guarani leaders who are participating in this process to the south, to the towns that you see on the lower half of your map. And so by the 1650s, by the 1670s and 80s, you're starting to see the Jesuit Guarani mission complex maturing. And in the 1730s, you reach the apogee of the Guarani Jesuit mission complex. There's something like 141,000 Guarani populating these 30 mission towns. So that's a process that's happening with kind of connections with the other processes that are happening in these other mission towns run by seculars and Franciscans near Asuncion. Okay, so given that overview, I think I can kind of go back and talk about a couple more examples that I tease out in the book. So if Spaniards are engaging Guarani through this cuñadazgo, this kind of kinship, and priests can't do that, but they're also using gifting. One of the things that I look at is the ways in which Guarani respond to these two interrelated processes, the evangelization by priests and these Spaniards who are engaging these communities through kinship. And I do this in a chapter of the book that deals with rebellion. I look at a figure named Juan Cuarazu. And Juan Cuarazu is a really interesting figure. He comes to us through a criminal trial. He also comes to us through a couple brief mentions in some Jesuit histories of the Jesuit mission complex. So the criminal litigation is by far the more interesting because it has his own words. He is captured and he is taken to Asuncion, where he is put on trial. And in 1625, he is assassinated by the Spanish governor in Asuncion for causing rebellion in the mission region. So let me tell you his story. Juan Cuarazu, as his name suggests, was baptized probably by a secular Franciscan priest in the region of Guairá. He was probably born in 1585. And he had Spaniards whom he served in the region of Guairá. And so he grew up knowing Spaniards. They were familiar to him. He was caused to work for Spaniards. At some point, he was sent to this region where yerba mate, this local tea that becomes this regional and almost a continental commodity, is harvested from these wild groves of yerba trees. One Spanish official called this yerba producing region the mines of Paraguay. They literally defined groves of trees as mines in order for the Spanish government to tax, right, the extraction of this tea. It's there that Cuarazu is maybe radicalized. He turns to what the document calls hechicería, sorcery, and is actually thrown in jail in this region. He escapes. It's one of many jail escapes that he has in his life, and he goes way south. He goes all the way down to Santa Fe, and he begins interacting with Charruan people. These are people with whom we would not expect a Guarani to be interacting in cooperative ways, but he says that he learns hechicería from a shaman among the Charrua. He gets in trouble again by a Spanish official, is locked up, and once again escapes. He flees to really close to Asuncion, and we learn that he has a wife in Asuncion, probably one of several. And he begins basically preaching a kind of message that is a distortion of the priestly message. And so I'm going to read to you a passage from the book that sort of describes this. It comes in a part of the book where I analyze a vision that Guaraní describes to the Spanish officials that are interrogating him. Guaraní never provided a comprehensive vision of what he desired, but his actions demonstrate that he hoped to invert the reducción, or the mission project, and make himself a priest. By taking what he perceived to be useful or powerful from the reducción, he hoped to create a kind of anti-reducción. Through his spiritual power, Guaraní worked to purge his community of the sickness he believed the priests had inflicted on Guaraní, and to return to practices that he understood to be socially regenerative, especially polygyny. Guaraní claimed that otherworldly powers called him to be a, quote, true priest. This prophetic call came in the form of a vision he had experienced during a yerba mate-induced trance. These shaman would take copious amounts of yerba, drink copious amounts, maybe have ingested the leaves themselves. Yerba mate is highly caffeinated, right? So you can imagine the kind of buzz this would have given them. The vision came to Guaraní during a trance he experienced with his Charruan counterpart. In the midst of a fast, the two consumed large quantities of yerba mate to the point that they vomited. They picked up the yerba mate bile mixture from the ground and threw it into the air. While tossing this substance, they exclaimed, "Colomi jubete," yerba be calm. The vomiting of this substance is consistent with modern Tupian groups where beverages used in ceremonial or shamanic practices are considered trance-inducing substances. The words yerba be calm are puzzling, but the simple fact that the Pache addressed the yerba reflects the spiritual qualities of the substance. After repeating the process, throwing the yerba in the air and speaking these words, Guaraní and the other shaman had visions of quote-unquote demons or diablos, whose bodies took the form of Indios and Spaniards. A few Indio demons were nude while others wore shirts. Demons in the shape of a Spaniard and Spaniards appeared with beards and dressed in more elaborate garb. One demon appeared under the brilliance of the noonday sun. He was running with a trumpet made of iron and exclaimed, "I am Takwa Bera. I am brilliant bamboo." In other demons appeared, some sumptuously arrayed in feathers, while others were chimerical. One had the feet of a mule and the body of a man. This parade of demons had an important message for the Pache. Call to all the Indios and tell them to leave the Spaniards. So in this passage and in this section of the deposition, what's remarkable is that there are several phrases left untranslated. This is extremely rare in Spanish documentation of this kind. Typically in, for example, Central Mexico, you would translate everything, right? And what I do here and in another publication I'm working on right now is show that there were probably phrases that were so familiar to Spaniards because Spaniards are learning Guarani, Creole Spaniards, local Spaniards, that, for example, tacuabera, right? Tacuara is this term that becomes common in Spanish for bamboo, but bera means resplendent. And the translator, the notary and the translator don't indicate that there was a gap in knowledge like they do for other phrases that were left untranslated. Other phrases where the interpreter says, "I'm at the limits of my knowledge here," reflect the growing differences between these variations of the language, the language spoken, the Guarani language spoken by Spaniards, and a language spoken by guys like Guaraní. So Guaraní's career, his life is reflective of others who moved in between the mission worlds, right? Who participated in colonial society, but also decided to move away from it and live in between it in some ways. The fact that this Guaraní was interested in returning to an era of polygyny is also very important, right? So this kind of brings me to to the next phase of the presentation here. One Jesuit priest said this really famous phrase. He said that in the early preaching of Christianity to Guarani, the Jesuits kept silent on the sixth commandment. And the sixth commandment, according to the Augustinian delineation of the commandments, is the commandment to not commit adultery. And what this meant was that Jesuits understood how central polygyny was to the society, how important it was to the leadership, especially in the society, that in the early years of constructing mission towns, they didn't preach against it. It had to be a process of kind of slowly bringing people into a situation of monogamy. I find this interesting because the Jesuits certainly did not silence the fifth commandment, which was the commandment against murder. And so while polygyny was slowly moved out, right, and slowly put pressure on, the practice of ritual killing was something that Jesuits immediately preached against. So my second project is dealing with the concept of war and the practice of violence in the Guarani mission towns. These Guarani mission towns possessed militias to defend their own communities, to participate in the defense of Spanish cities. And the militias that were organized in the Franciscan secular missions were different from the militias that were organized in the Guarani Jesuit missions. The Guarani Jesuit missions possessed gunpowder militias where they owned firearms, which was kind of a socio-political coup at the time. Spaniards flipped a wig when they learned that the Jesuits were arming the Guarani with firearms. And so I'm kind of tracing the development of these gunpowder militias and the political fights over them to also look at the process by which Jesuits and Spaniards are trying to change Guarani notions of war and violence from licit to illicit violence. So to kind of lead you into some of the linguistic traces that I'm following, I'm going to show you a passage from the earliest lexicons produced by a Jesuit named Antonio Ruiz de Montoya. These lexicons were published in 1639. And they're really a fascinating texts. I never thought in all of my life that I would love reading dictionaries, but I can spend hours in these things. And the reason is that Ruiz de Montoya, the way he records Guarani terms is that you can tell that at moments he's drawing on Guarani phrases that have social meaning in the context in which he was writing these things. At the same time, Montoya is part of what one scholar calls the creation of a trans language. That is, Montoya is trying to promote a changed culture, right? A Christianized Guarani culture. And so he's using language to do this. And you do this through a variety of ways. First, you rationalize the language by writing it down according to kind of Latin forms, hence the lexicons. But you also create neologisms, right? So how do you say carnal sin? Well, Montoya comes up with the term cuñapo tajara, which means he who desires a woman, right? So placing the burden on the female body, right, to create this idea of carnal sin. So I'm looking at these lexicons in this way and then tracing them in the later documentation. So let me just jump into this phrase that sort of pops up out of nowhere. I don't find anywhere else in the Guarani language corpus. So the term is mba'i in Guarani, And Montoya gives this translation. They say this for Spaniards, a word taken from the name, and I have to shrink this down for a minute so I can actually see. A word taken from the name porridge, maipura, because they say that in older times, they, the Guarani, killed a Spaniard and ate him boiled, and from the soup they made porridge, and therefore it became a saying, and because the saying was so well known, they shortened the word. This is a really curious entry. Montoya is registering here and indexing this term with this parenthetical, they say this, right, which he does hundreds of times throughout his lexicons, and I think is a really useful tool for finding kind of socially relevant terminology. This is a word that we can imagine as a kind of playful joke, perhaps, right? We can imagine that Guarani are saying this perhaps under their breath to Spaniards, to name a Spaniard. And what they're referencing here is ritual sacrifice, the killing of a captive. Guarani, at the time of contact, many practiced anthropophagy. And anthropophagy was a form of, in some ways, you can see it as a form of social regeneration. The captive was taken and was killed in a ritual that involved lots of festivity and inviting lots of neighbors. And the captive would be taken because another of their own community had been killed by an enemy. And they're not just killing them immediately. Tupi-Guarani peoples would take that captive and make them their own. You had to become Guarani before you could be killed. It kind of reflects this sense that there has to be a reciprocity here, and in this way, it's a negative reciprocity, but one that is generative, right? One that is socially meaningful. And so the victim would be killed, and often the victim would be turned into a porridge so that it could be shared more broadly. Other accounts suggest that even the bones of the victim were pound into a powder and then put into this porridge and shared. And so what I'm doing in this project is through a study of Guarani language sources, I'm finding a bit of dark humor that's punctuating some of this language. I think that the scholarship perhaps has taken the Guarani too seriously when it comes to violence. And so the Guarani terminology is in sort of linguistic anthropological approaches to this topic, I'm finding are a way for us to sort of move around and work with the scholarship that can be fairly structuralist, and a scholarship that has sometimes frozen Guarani culture in time. And so the use of these sources is really quite powerful. One last note here: the lexicons were updated in the early 18th century by an Italian priest named Paolo Restivo. And Restivo is going to use terminology that I'm following that talks about warfare. And so in an entry that is this vocabulario is an update of Ruiz de Montoya's 1639 vocabulario. But Restivo in the 1720s is adding new terms, new phrases that are relevant to that particular moment when you have these fully formed, matured mission complex. And so in one entry, in an entry called a lawful thing or lawful, it says, it is lawful to kill your enemy in war. And if you go back and look at the original Guarani that Restivo provides, and you do a translation of that original in a more literal way, it says, in war, one counters to kill the enemy, but only to want to escape. So what I'm seeing here is through this Guarani language, Jesuits essentially explaining just war to Guarani, who are operating within their own militias and do have to kill enemies. Enemies that are indigenous and enemies that are European in origin. So they're fighting against Portuguese. They're called to fight against French pirates. And so the language sources provide this useful window into new directions for studying Guarani culture as it evolves in the colonial period. Well, that's all I have. So I'm going to stop there and open up for questions.
When you were talking about the gentleman who had been hallucinating and felt as though he was like one of the priests, but like reterming it, you know, I just thought about like Black liberation theology, to where they kind of took that religion as their own. Did you ever think about that, or you ever studied on that?
I have not used Black liberation theology to analyze these sources, but definitely there's resonances there and useful ways of thinking about this. One of the things that Guaraní does is he's adopting Jesuit modes of organizing. So for example, Jesuits, you know, following through on Spanish mandates, organized town councils in the missions, and they gave to indigenous leaders staffs of justice, these bastones that they call them. Guaraní has his own bastones. He has his own staffs of justice that he distributes to some of his disciples, who then disperse his word to neighboring communities to try to get people to flee the missions and join his own anti-reducción. So there's a ton of that stuff going on. Other Guarani shaman are performing debaptisms, scraping the tongues of baptized Guarani. One shaman who kills a Jesuit, several Jesuits, is going to don the chasuble and adorn it with feathers and perform an anti-mass. And so it's a really dynamic kind of relationship between the Christianity, and Jesuits are playing the same game, right? They're appearing at villages at dawn when shamans would appear at villages. Jesuits have to organize Guarani for war when enemy indigenous come to their communities. So yeah, it's a really can sometimes be disorienting in the sources to follow this, but most definitely. Thanks for the comment, Shawn.
Thank you.
I'll jump in. Thank you so much for this remarkable talk. I'm really happy I was able to make it. I teach at Central New Mexico Community College, and I have interests in questions of political identity and colonial history. But also, I've been reading this recently, Substance and Seduction, which is about, are you familiar? It's about, I think you'd love, it's about the role, the agency, the political agency of intoxicants in the colonial context, in the Latin American context. So I'm like currently reading this. It was a great resonance with this just depiction of yerba mate, and I found that fascinating. But that's not what my question is about. I had a question I jotted down at the very beginning that I'd love to just get your take on. I wrote down, you said that Argentines they kind of want to disavow they want to be true Argentines without the complication of indigeneity. And I found that fascinating. I was just curious, like, what is the meaning and the significance of a true Argentine identity, and why is indigeneity like a complicating factor? Does it have to do with race? Is it more about national identity and kind of a disavowal? Yeah, I'd love to hear more on that.
Yeah. So Corrientes, Argentina, and the sort of northeastern part of Argentina, they share this. The dynamics in Argentina are somewhat different in Paraguay, but you have some similarities, and it's just this, right? That indigeneity over the course of the late 18th and 19th centuries and early 20th centuries, right, is made other. It's made barbaric in some ways. But the traces of that indigeneity, right, if we're using that phrase, that terminology loosely, is the language itself. And this is not easily eradicated, and nor do many national leaders want to eradicate it, at least in Paraguay, right? It becomes a tool of nationalism in Paraguay. In Corrientes, it's, and Misiones, Argentina, it's much more kind of cultural, social process that that is out of many leaders' control. But today, it's much less common for people to be speaking it. When I spoke to a group of undergraduate students in the neighboring town of Resistencia, they were just enthralled with the study of the language, because many of them grew up hearing their grandparents and even their parents speaking it, but they didn't want to do it in public, right? Because they were ashamed of it. The town of Resistencia is a reference to, it was an Italian, a colony of Italian immigrants who basically slaughtered indigenous people in the Chaco, right? They called the town Resistencia from the Chaco Indians. So there is a profound racism, right? That is kind of weaving through, right, this culture. And many people feel a kind of tension over it. In Paraguay, that's less so, right? In Paraguay, the language has become nationalized, right? And so you don't identify as indigenous, even though you speak Guarani. And to be clear, the Guarani that many Paraguayans are speaking, even in the countryside, right, is very different from the Guarani spoken, it's different from the Guarani spoken by Umbua communities, these indigenous communities that are speaking kind of variant of it. And the colonial documentation that I'm reading, which some scholars call classical Guarani, right, because they're seeing it as maybe a sort of Jesuit construction. It's emerging in the missions, and we're much more complicated now about how we talk about it, because there is an internal kind of cultural evolution of the language in the missions, while the Jesuits are trying to create this trans language, and they kind of get mixed together. But at the end of the day, Guarani are still maintaining their right, that this is a process that is sort of out of the Jesuits' control in some ways. So we have different contexts in which this is evolving. But yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. Elliot, tell me the name of that book again, Substance.
Yeah, it's an edited volume, Substance and Seduction. And then the subtitle is Ingested Commodities in Early Modern Mesoamerica, University of Texas Press.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, it's great.
Do we have any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat as well, if you aren't able or willing to.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Kim.
Hey, Shawn, that was such an amazing document that you showed us right at the beginning, right? The 1682 Cabildo record. So my question is, that's actually kind of late for a Cabildo. I mean, since Spaniards had invaded, right? A couple generations earlier. Who's on the Cabildo in this period of time? Can you talk a little bit more about this body and how it functioned inside these indigenous communities?
Yeah. So the document is the earliest that we have found in the region. Whilst, as you point out, recognizing that, yeah, these are really old. These cabildos are created in the earliest moments. We know that Jesuits, Franciscans are kind of drawing people into the communities by allowing indigenous caciques and sort of higher level leaders to maintain a position of authority. And so these things are organized from the get-go. But the records themselves are kind of coming down to us in scattershot ways. And so it's exciting for us now, right, to see these, and coming from a Franciscan, community, not a Jesuit. The earliest Jesuit cabildo is from 1754 or something like that that we have record of, even though we know they're organized early. Who's on them? So the scholarship on this shows that the priests are really working to uphold these kinds of leadership, these family heads, and they're working to sustain the power of these family heads, these caciques. And then you have other leaders who are going to get the title of don, right? And they might be a cacique or they might not, right? But they're going to be people who are working more closely with the priest. Maybe their son is put into the colegio, is being trained to read Latin. Maybe they're being trained to sing to the priest during their meals. They're singing in the choirs. And the Jesuits really work to make sure that these families stay in power. And over the years, I think that these families then are working to keep themselves into positions of authority. And so we can trace these names. In the case of Itatí, we're seeing these names carry over for over 100 years, right? The last names of these leaders. In the Jesuit context, we know that some of the earliest pre-contact caciques, right, chieftains, are maintaining a status as leaders within the communities, either as corregidores, right, as the governors of the mission towns. And this carries through the entire colonial period. So one family, the Nyengiru family, in the 1750s, there's a crisis that takes place. Guaraní write all these letters to the royal officer in Buenos Aires, and one of the authors of this letter is Nyengiru, and he describes his genealogy, and he says that my grandfather was the first to receive the Jesuits, right? And so you can kind of see this Guaraní Jesuit sense of leadership, sense of almost apocalyptic kind of history that's being weaved together here. The officers of the cabildo, you have the governor, you usually have a lieutenant, you have two alcaldes, you're going to have a flag, an alferez, a flag bearer. The number of regidores, we don't have enough systematic study of the cabildos to know how many are on there, a handful. And then there's typically a secretary who kind of functions as a notary. So we hope to, we're working, I'm actually just kind of building up this project at the moment with another scholar. We're going to first translate the Guaraní entries of the elections. There are 8 Guaraní language election registers, the earliest from 1708. And so we need to kind of study the verbs that are being used and the terminology for calling together the cabildo. And then we can begin to study the structure of the cabildo and compare it to other places.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shawn. No, it's just fascinating how Indigenous authority, right, it connects to Spaniards in this period and in that region, and for generations, right? It's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Kim.